are. It's late. Hang on, let me try to give you a sense for the room right now. From a certain perspective, I've been lucky that for most of my adult life, I've lived in very old buildings in the range of 70 to 100 years old for the most part. Almost all of them have had hardwood floors, which I really like. Earlier today, I finished watching the Adult Swim show Pera Talks with You, which is the subject of this video. In a little bit, I'll get into some of the more conventional media commentary stuff that I usually do. But it's hard for me to talk about the show without also trying to give a sense of the personal value that it has to me. So I finished watching the show, and for whatever combination of reasons, I had a hard time just trying to melt back into my usual routine. I was actually choked up for a while, which is rare for me. And I couldn't nail down an exact reason for it either. It probably wasn't just the show all by itself. There are a couple of reasons why I've been feeling a bit gloomier than usual, and I don't really want to talk about those here. But I do think the show kind of broke me down pretty well, and for a while I just did what I usually do when I feel overwhelmed, which is to just pace around the room a bunch for however long it takes, basically. I live in a pretty small place. If you've been watching the channel for a while, or if you know me in real life, then you've probably seen it before. But with all of the amount of stuff that I have in the room, I always try to keep a clear path from the door at one corner of the apartment all the way over to the bathroom, which is in the opposite corner. The floors have a great creak to them, I think, especially in really specific spots. So I live on the ground floor of the apartment building here, but we have a basement right underneath with the laundry room and the water heater. There's some shut-off valves and fuse boxes, stuff like that. So the creaks tend to be over the places with less immediate support. You can actually hear the echo into the basement for some of these. And it's really nice when I'm pacing around to just end up in the bathroom over and over, because it definitely has the best natural light in the apartment, probably because of the wall color. When I was living in a different city a long time ago, I used to have this really nice room with a great bay window and floorboard heating, hardwood floors. And there was a time when I wasn't feeling very good, and all I could make myself do was just walk back and forth for like at least a couple hours, just over and over again. I had an IKEA rug in the center of the room running right down the middle, but even through that I could still hear the floor creaks, which was kind of comforting. I think it was January when this particular episode was going on, and this was in a city that got a lot of snow, and I think we even had a pretty bad blizzard that year. I've lived in California for a while, and the way I feel about real winter is probably similar to how a lot of other people feel about it who used to live somewhere with seasons and then moved out here, where I miss the cold and the snow, and I also don't. It's nice to think about, but in real life, it's both better and worse. The good stuff about it is better, and the bad stuff is definitely worse. Pera Talks with You is a show that's extremely fixated on a specific part of the United States, but I think it does an impressive job of capturing certain qualities that I've noticed in many different places all around basically this portion of the country here. It's dangerous to say that any piece of media feels especially American, because that label always excludes more than it should, but I would call this show incredibly American, specifically in a way that I don't know whether I've seen before. There's a well-established precedent for making small-town America come across as backward, sad, slow. In fact, I remember talking to a friend about some of our favorite writers and directors who just happened to be from the East Coast or the Midwest, and he asked me whether there's something inherently sad about that part of the country since I grew up in that general area, and I just said yes without really thinking about it. If I set out to make something about how those places feel, I would probably focus on that kind of vague sadness. A phrase that sticks in my mind comes from Regular Car Reviews video, and coincidentally the creators of that channel are from my home state of Pennsylvania. So they're talking about this near universal process of growing up and then wanting to leave your hometown. So at one point he describes this non-specific kind of theoretical hometown as the kind of place where schools go out of business. For one thing, it's just a really good line, and I understand it completely. I relate to it even, but there's a lot more to say about those kinds of places. A lot more than just looking at the surface level ugliness and the monotony and decay. I get the sense that the team behind Joe Pera Talks With You has a very personal and maybe even profound understanding of these kinds of places, generally unremarkable small towns that don't seem well suited for any kind of narrative attention. It's either that or they came to an understanding of these kinds of places while working on the show. There isn't just one good thing to talk about here. It's basically all good. The writing presents this beautiful, unified, and very original voice. The editing is much more noticeable than it is in most shows, but it never grabs the spotlight for too long, and the performances and direction somehow fall into this space of being intelligent without ever talking down to the characters or the audience. At times it feels like this heightened children's show world, but there are also very consistent, realistic elements too. The character of Joe Pera feels like the type of figure who's supposed to passively prove to others that it's better to be like kind and curious and genuine, but the side characters basically stay themselves the entire time. There aren't many character arcs in general. I would even say that typical story structure doesn't have much of a presence at all, which might frustrate some people, but I loved the resulting looseness. It lets the writers do almost anything. They can tell a heartwarming story if they want to, but they can also take an episode in a completely different direction or throw in some major twists that just mirror unexpected events in real life. On paper, Joe Pera isn't a very good protagonist, but I would argue that he's not actually a protagonist. He does go on a journey throughout the course of the show, and he's incredibly likable. It's great to have him on screen, but he often feels much more like a host who's just directing our attention to all these other characters and locations. In contrast to most dramatic and comedic screenwriting, Joe Pera isn't very expressive at all. Any strong emotions get reduced to subtle facial expressions or maybe just meekly looking at the ground. Joe also has the same cadence and conversational tone, regardless of whether he's talking to like a close relative or a store clerk that he just met for the first time. I think it's an arresting lead performance, honestly. And I also think that Joe Firestone was a fantastic choice for the role of Sarah Connor, who's a middle school band teacher and Joe's girlfriend. It also seems like Firestone was heavily involved behind the scenes with numerous writing and producing credits throughout the show. It's also worth talking about the show's tonal shifts. Most of the time it's relaxing, serene, and kind, but it can shift drastically at any moment. There are times here, specific scenes and just even lines in the show that made me feel deeply uncomfortable. And I guess this is the part where I should address potential influences. I wasn't able to think of much else that feels like Joe Pera Talks With You, but there are definitely moments when I was reminded of non-horror portions of David Lynch movies and shows, but more than anything else, I was especially reminded of the David Byrne movie, True Stories from 1986. It's also about a small American town. It also features a fairly deadpan male narrator/guide, and it also has a similar approach to offering strangeness and humor that never becomes condescending. And it's definitely a strange show, this one. I don't know if I've suggested that strongly enough. It's an Adult Swim program, and while I really appreciate the level of creative freedom on display in a lot of Adult Swim projects, they often execute a tone and, specific flavor of weirdness that doesn't click with me. I'm glad that it's happening, but typically there's not a lot of utility there. Somehow, Joe Pera Talks With You only ever got weird in a way that worked just beautifully for me. And apparently that's been true for plenty of other people too. For example, the only glimpse I've gotten into the show's fan base was from an email a while back. I've been on the Joe Pera newsletter mailing list for a while, and sometime between seasons 2 and 3, he sent something about how happy he was to see that so many other people were growing their own bean arches. in their backyard. But briefly on the topic of fan bases or just how other people have been reacting to the show, I don't feel motivated to delve into that stuff. It's not the kind of thing where I want to have a conversation about it. Normally, I would ask you to share your own thoughts, and you definitely can, but I don't think I'll be reading them this time. I really wanted to try and articulate how I feel about the show right now, immediately after watching it. I've talked a lot about the impossibility of objectivity in media criticism, and it's still true. I still believe that. When we consume a piece of media, it triggers a kind of chemical reaction with all that you are in that moment. So for each of us, the product of that reaction is completely different. I don't know how you're going to feel about this show, and I'm not going to tell you how to feel about it, but I can confidently say that it's been one of the most affecting media experiences I've had in years. But that's all for now. Thanks for stopping by.